Sri Aurobindo is describing the nature of the cosmic consciousness. Having described the means of attaining to it, we now enter into what that experience does in changing our human life and its values. First of all, he had described the distinction of this experience as when the yogin no longer feels himself to be a consciousness situated in the body or limited by the mind, but has lost the sense of division in the boundlessness of an infinite consciousness. That which he set out to do is accomplished. And we dwelt on this at some length. Subsequently, he described this merging in the cosmic consciousness as a merging into the Satchidananda. Because after all, what we are experiencing, that into which the separateness has been dissolved, is one eternal existence, one eternal consciousness, one eternal will or force, and one eternal delight itself and all of its workings. And this consciousness is stable, immutable, timeless, spaceless, supreme, and still in the infinity of its workings, not changed by their variations, not broken up by their multiplicity, not confused by the apparent contraries. So we dwelt on this in some detail last time, how this consciousness is not only a consciousness of oneness, but it knows the multiplicities, it knows the variations without losing the sense of oneness. Satchidananda, he concluded, is the unity of the many-sidedness of manifested things, the eternal harmony of all their variations and oppositions, the infinite perfection which justifies their limitations and is the goal of their imperfections. Now, as an analogy, simply to give to our physical mind a sense of the relationship between what this sense of unity is in relation to the variation and multiplicity, one can look at the experience as from the bedrock at the bottom of the ocean, where the entire ocean gigantic, is extending outward. The variations and movements are of many kinds. At the most surface layer, there are the waves, the ripples, the foam, the tiniest insect settling in the ocean water will create tiny ripples. The most powerful, gigantic hurricane will create swirls and waves. But in relation to the depth of the ocean, those are equally trivial. If it is a swell that rises, which can create a tsunami, or if it is a tiny ripple of a grain of dust that falls into the ocean surface, they are equivalent. Depth of the ocean is never confused of its identity, of its completeness by those variations. Experience of the oneness of the Satchidananda, similarly, one has the experiences of the ebbings and flowings in the seas of time and space, and that's why he uses this analogy. Things rise, things fall, there are tides, there are movements. But at no point is it confused by their apparent contrarieties or limited by their divinely willed limitations. So it is the ocean itself that chooses to wave around, but the ocean does not end up saying, I am wave, or this one wave against that other wave. And this gives us a sense of that. But equally, this analogy can be taken a little further. We notice the ripples and waves on the surface. We also notice the tides. The tides have longer movements across a larger span of time, across days, across weeks. Even there is a seasonal variation there. And these, again, to the self, are simply variations of the surface. Deeper down, there are currents, more steady. And they represent movements of the ocean or an aspect or a part of the ocean. Again, in the totality of the ocean, no two currents are ever seen as limitations or oppositions of itself. But at the deepest base of the ocean, there is this very special experience which one has to appreciate to be able to understand the relationship of the Satchidananda's oneness with the multiplicity. In the deepest base of the ocean, although you may never experience any of the movements of the waves, there is a continuity. When a wave takes place in the ocean, where does the water come from? From the ocean itself. From which part of the ocean? We may say from the surface parts of the ocean, but where does that movement come from? It includes water from deeper parts of the ocean. Where does that water move from? Influenced by waters from deeper parts. And so one can say, if you look at the experience of the totality of the ocean, every time there is a wave that swells up, the entire ocean is as if participating and leaning to experience and to form that wave. It may be a tiny shift at the base of the ocean, but still it is there and it is measurable. And when another wave comes up in a contrary direction, it is again the entire ocean leaning to become that contrary wave. And when on the crest of the wave there is a bubble of foam, it is the entire ocean supporting that bubble of foam and allowing its experience of separateness to emerge. And when we begin to dwell on this idea, we realize everything that's happening on the surface, the tiniest ripples to the hurricanes, to the whirlpools, and all our movements of the entire ocean putting up one or other aspect or form or movement or ripple. But it is always the entire undivided ocean. And from the perspective of the Satchidananda, it is in this way that it sees all this multiplicity, variation, working, ebbing and flowing, apparent contrarieties, self-willed limitations. Because it is the entire ocean which chooses to become a wave, it can choose how much of itself it puts into this wave, how much of itself it puts into another wave. Larger or smaller in relation to each other, Satchidananda, they are equally all of itself, putting up a special aspect. And that's why he says Satchidananda is the unity of the many-sidedness of manifested things. It is on the surface what you're seeing as waves, as manifested things, because that's where forms appear which are distinct. You dive deeper into the ocean, you have currents, forces, but no distinct forms. You go down further, and even the currents seem to fade out. There is only the will supporting the current, which appear as forces, which repeating and rhythms become forms. And so the full many-sidedness of the manifestation is held in the unity, and a single unity holding all of these special aspects without ever interfering or ever experiencing itself split or divided. And each finest, tiniest, trivial detail, it supports entirely in its oneness. And therefore, because it holds them all together in its oneness never shaken or divided, it is also, he says, the eternal harmony of all their variations and oppositions. You see, it's a very interesting thing. He says, harmony of variations we would understand. Harmony of oppositions. To the surface mind, when you see opposition, you do not call it harmony. Together in some particular pattern, never colliding, we would say, this is harmony. That also is an aspect of its harmony. In the oneness, one can know that. In the appearances, we may not recognize that. How this is, he will elaborate in the next paragraph, so we don't need to dwell on it further. But that this is the harmony. It's not just the unity of the multiplicity, it is also the harmony of all the variations and oppositions. Any variation you take, however diverse, since it is the whole ocean leaning to put out that variation, in the ocean's oneness, they are in perfect alignment in the harmony. And finally, the third facet of this Satchidananda is the infinite perfection which justifies their limitations of their imperfections. So this perfection, it is an infinite perfection. What does that mean? To our surface sensory experience is when a form is, what does that mean? This food cooked, this sculpture is perfectly made, is perfectly wrapped. What do we mean? If you go deeper into the sense of what you're experiencing that you would call perfection, there are so many fine nuances, smells, tastes, colors, forms. If any one of them stuck out in a way that it broke the harmony of things, you would say, something is not okay. This is too much or that is too little. In perfect alignment with everything else, it is that sense of the complete harmony that we call perfect. Or a sculpture is made, it expresses something, and you cannot find any part, any sense of it, which is out of alignment with the whole. And you would say, perfect. On a very crude geometric figure, it's easy. A perfect sphere would be one which is mathematically perfect in its size. But when it comes to something which is more unusually shaped, the form of a human being, or a tree, or an animal, or even a stone which has been carved by years of erosion, you can see in it a kind of a perfection. Everything is perfectly aligned to everything else. It's the sense of the harmony between everything else. This perfection draws from the previous description, which is eternal harmony. And the harmony itself has at its core the sense of the underlying oneness which holds all the pieces in right relation to each other. and draws from the previous description of Satchidananda as the unity of the many-sidedness. So you see a progression between these three ideas. Satchidananda is at the same time unity of many-sidedness of manifested things, harmony of all their variations and oppositions, infinite perfection. Now you'll see here in the description of each, there's first the unity, and then the eternal harmony, and then the infinite perfection. And we need to dwell upon the distinction here. As we know, Sri Aurobindo uses these words very precisely. The eternal harmony, because a harmony could be momentary. There is a spontaneous falling into place or accidental falling into place, which means we don't know how it happened, but it happened. It fell into place. Momentarily, everything was right, but it didn't last. As a child, I had seen a cartoon in a magazine called Omni, where there's a caveman who's taken a piece of stone, chalk, something, and is playing on the wall with lines and symbols. And first he draws horizontal lines, and then he fills in vertical lines. And as he's going through, accidentally, he ends up writing E equals mc square. Okay, and in the next image, he fills in with diagonal lines, and everything becomes a jumble crisscross again. What is interesting in the cartoon is in the first, when he draws the series of horizontal lines, the horizontals of the E, of the equals, and the top part of the M, all of those are there. They make no sense. When the vertical lines are added, suddenly everything falls into place. You see this profound, deep, spiritual, even truth. And then further lines are added in the continuity in time, and everything is obliterated. So you may be watching the flow of the river, and suddenly, spontaneously, everything falls into place. You have a brilliant harmony, and poof, it's gone the next moment. That wouldn't have much value. We would not call it a harmony unless it sustains itself to some degree. And therefore, Sri Aurobindo uses this word, eternal harmony. In the Satchidananda, the harmony is not only complete, but in the unfoldment of the harmony, it stays a harmony as everything moves. So in the play on the waves on the surface of the ocean, as the tsunami begins to move, everything else adjusts itself in the ocean in perfect alignment to the wave of the tsunami. As the tsunami collapses, everything else constantly adjusts itself in perfect alignment. As the bird dives into the water to catch a fish and creates this waves and ripples, everything in the ocean is aligning to that movement of the bird. The state of harmony is not static. It is an unfolding, dynamic, and eternal harmony of all the variations and oppositions. When he's now describing the sense of the perfection is of the form. And here it is in harmony in the domain of form, not in the unfolding of time. And there the perfection could be limited. Here's a mountain. It is extremely ugly except for this particular outcrop, which is beautiful and perfect. Wouldn't mean much. But in the Satchidananda, everything is in that harmony across the whole of infinity. Nothing left out, the tiniest detail held, and that's what makes it for an infinite perfection. So when the harmony, which is not necessarily bounded to form, takes on a more formal character and includes the whole, it becomes the infinite perfection. So again, you see the three stages: unity in the many-sidedness, eternal harmony of all the variations and oppositions, infinite perfection. And so since the Satchidananda is holding everything, the perfection is therefore also infinite. And the infinity we have to also understand more deeply. The nature of infinity, because human mind is normally a creature and an instrument of finitenesses. Our experience with infinity is a bit problematic. We are able to conceive of pieces and conceive of relations between pieces. But the moment the piece becomes beyond our limit, beyond our ken, crosses into infinity, we can't deal with it anymore. If the number of pieces, this is in perfect harmony with that and that and that, if the number becomes too large, again, we are unable to manage it. So we have ideas of infinity, but we don't have experiences of infinity in the human mind. The full understanding or experience of infinity reveals something extraordinary to us. Look at the whole infinity. Let's say you take, as an analogy again, a single line, stretch a string out into infinity. In your mind, you're seeing a piece of the string, its ends blurring out. That's all you can hold. You cannot know the full because the mind cannot handle an infinite. But now if you look at the string, stretch it. Let it squeeze. Has anything changed? It's still infinite, remember. You squeeze it. Think of it as an elastic. You put 2 marks on it. Stretch it to 10 times its size. The 2 marks have spread out. Come close. If you didn't have those 2 markers, if you didn't have them, you would not be able to make out anything in the string has moved. Isn't it? Now, if you have the 2 markers, you stretch the string 10 times, but you also move back 10 times, you would notice no difference. I'm giving this example to awaken us to a deep insight. You could take any part of the string and stretch it into the infinite, and you would still have the infinite inside that part. This is the nature of the infinite, which the mind then finds difficult to grasp. You could take any part of the infinite, and within it you would find infinity. If you take numbers 1 to infinity, let's double this. So take all the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, and so on up to infinity. Let them step aside, and then all the even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, up to infinity, and let them step aside. Suddenly, you will have 2 lines going out into infinity. Out of what? What was 1 line which is infinite? You draw out the infinite out of infinite, and what is left? Infinity again. The same infinite. It has not reduced 1 bit. You will recall the Dhyana Shloka, the meditative prayer before the Isha Upanishad, which goes like this: that is complete or infinite. Purnam. Purnam adaha, that. Purnam idam, this also is complete, infinite. And although this complete infinite has emerged out of that complete infinite remains complete and infinite. This is interesting. Within the totality of the Satchidananda's infinite perfection, you could take any part of it perfect infinitely. You take a seashell, enter into it with your microscope, zoom in all you want unendingly, and everything is perfect and perfect and perfect, infinitely deep into it. Zoom out of it and look at the sea beach on which it is situated, and look at the whole of its context, zoom out and out infinitely, and at each step it is perfect, perfect, perfect. So Sri Aurobindo points this out in this way. He says, in one of the aphorisms, he says, the effort that the divine puts in the forming of a seashell, the same effort that he puts in the building of an entire civilization. In another poem, he says, in the strength of a man, in the beauty of a woman, in the laugh of a boy, in the blush of a girl, the hand that sent Jupiter spinning through heaven spends all its cunning to fashion a curl. So here is the in the balance. The hand that sent Jupiter spinning through heaven, and Jupiter is so gigantic, massive. The power needed, that incredible, enormous power, that hand turns and uses all of its cunning, the intelligence aspect here, to fashion a curl. In what? In the strength of a man, in the beauty of a woman, in the laugh of a boy, in the blush of a girl. When you think about what that means, in tiniest detail of the human being and the experience and things we put out. And again, here there is this aspect of the strength knowledge also playing. In the tiniest detail, that entire power and all its intelligence is fully engaged to make the tiniest detail of a curl. And in fact, when you take up a single hair strand and begin to enter into it with the microscope, you can see extraordinarily complex structures. Increasingly, as we explore the universe, we call it fractal. That is, the pattern which is in the whole is repeating itself inside the pieces, parts. Not only is it fractal, it is also holographic. The part contains the whole in some sense, or is an aspect, an outlook towards the whole. And these are just analogies to certain technological vocabularies we have developed. But the underlying reality is just this. It is a oneness which is infinite perfection. Now, this nature of the infinite perfection is such that he says, which justifies their limitations and is the goal of their imperfections. It now places this Satchidananda's completeness with what we see on the surface or experience on the surface. Remember earlier he was describing how the oneness knows the multiplicities without being confused by their multiplicity. And those multiplicities, the variations and oppositions of the waves that you saw, have limitations. This wave is smaller, that wave is bigger, this wave hitting that wave is unable to do this, unable to overcome that. All limitations are justified by this infinite perfection. So, yes, so that's the thing to dwell on. Why is it justified? If you had an imperfection that you were unable to overcome, you would say, this fellow, no hope. But if there is an extraordinary perfection which puts forward an appearance of an imperfection only for the sake of an appearance, what would you call that imperfection? You'd say, it is perfection playing with, revealing something, some aspect of itself. And if it was not so, if the world was in fact in reality imperfections, then you just call it a bad designed universe, badly made, poorly created by someone who's incompetent. When it is this extraordinary, infinite perfection of an eternal harmony of a oneness, putting out an appearance of something which appears imperfect, then you'll say, what an extraordinary skill. I'm going to give an analogy here with certain kinds of drama or even music or cinema. Sometimes these are called period films. Okay, you are replicating the mood of a certain period or of a certain conflict that took place during that period. So looking at some of these movies, you feel quite terrible. Suppose it was during a war or during a time of great suffering in humanity where a few people struggled to bring some higher values and failed. It's pathetic, pitiable, unhappy, sad. But you say, this director recreated that mood of that age so perfectly, so beautifully, so completely. Not a flaw there. You see the idea? It is a perfect creation of something which was not so happy, somewhat imperfect. but perfectly made. Exactly. The imperfection is perfect. And this is the nature of the master artist. Where necessary for the sake of the experience, he can create an image which is imperfect, but so perfectly done that you could not change one little bit of it that would somehow break that imperfection that is so perfectly expressed. There are people who sing. That's the other example. They will sing, and while singing, the voice will break just to express an emotion of sadness. As I sing, suddenly the voice fails in the sadness and breaks. But it's done so carefully, so perfectly in their control, in the mastery that they have of the voice, that you can catch the sense of the pathos as the voice breaks. And you know it's been done deliberately, flawlessly. And so the perfection which justifies the limitation and is the goal of their imperfections. So whatever you have as a limitation which appears imperfect is only struggling to realize and express more and more that perfection. So we reread this full sentence. Satchidananda is the unity of the many-sidedness of manifested things, the eternal harmony of all their variations and oppositions, the infinite perfection which justifies their limitations and is the goal of their imperfections. Whose limitations, whose imperfections, whose variations and oppositions? The manifested things and the infinitely manifested things in everything. And you'll find here again this idea which we have come across in our study of the Kena Upanishad, where Sri Aurobindo explained how in the duality which we experience, in the limited consciousness of mind which sees pieces, naturally one thing is placed against another. There are two sides, there's the positive and the negative. The positives are the things which are aiming at the perfection. They never reach it. But each time they move a little further, the direction in which they move are perfection. The negatives are that which say, whatever you do, you never reach that. Whatever you do, you fail. Because that is beyond you. The absolute is beyond the relative. And so there's a double side. One side which is attempting, and the direction of its attempt represents the evolutionary progress. And the other side which is opposing, which is only affirming the insufficiency. And that's why we have cycles. Living, as it approaches some form of the perfection, it feels itself so great, so perfect. I have come from here imperfect to this perfection. I am now complete and perfect. And immediately the negative comes and says, no, you are not. And if it breaks it, it is only possible because you didn't reach perfection. Or it breaks that which is still imperfect or incomplete and compels a rebuilding to still greater perfection. And so we have this play of the duality. But when you look from inside the duality, from this perspective, you can see, this is the game. From that perspective, from the oneness, from within the infinite perfection, then you see this, the play of limitation, imperfection, and the variations and oppositions, which represent a harmony of that development. So this is where the paragraph we were reading last time of the cosmic consciousness being nothing but the Satchidananda. What happens then as a result of an experience or a dwelling and a living in this? It is evident that by dwelling in this cosmic consciousness, our whole experience and valuation of everything in the universe will be radically changed. That we have to say is obvious. What will change though? What is it that is incompatible with that experience? And how does it transition into that experience? How is that thing seen from within that experience. So this is the discussion, the rest of this paragraph and the next. So in this paragraph, he describes the limitation of the consciousness we live in. Describes what changes when we shift to this to the higher consciousness, limitations from its perspective. Remember, the transition was also of your nature, of your consciousness, which was ego-based itself in that which is the cosmic consciousness. So in this poise, as individual egos, we dwell in the ignorance, capital I, and judge everything by a broken, partial standard of knowledge. So we dwell in the ignorance, capital I. Ignorance is the consciousness of division. By itself, it's not a crime. That's our starting point. We emerge as a fragment and are growing towards a greater and greater completeness. But as long as we are bound to the fragment, as long as we identify with the fragmentation, we are living in ignorance. So we dwell in the ignorance as individual egos. First is the state of consciousness in ignorance. Second, how it then engages with everything else. We judge everything by a broken, partial, and personal standard of knowledge. So everywhere Sri Aurobindo is going to the most essential behind that limitation. First principle is everything is from a knowledge which is broken. And from a broken knowledge, we judge everything else. Why is the knowledge broken? It is broken. We are in ignorance, meaning we are a piece. The pieces. Everything else is pieces. And so our knowledge is also broken. What do we know about? A piece of other things, a piece. Everywhere it is a broken knowledge. Second degree from here is partial. You may have many broken pieces, but all the pieces together you might say, and this is the whole illusion of science. It does not recognize illusion of modern science. Recognize that there is a possibility of an undivided whole to experience and live in that. It assumes the nature of reality is pieces. And therefore the nature of knowledge is also pieces. And the method of science basically states that each one goes and verifies pieces, and having verified them, puts them together like a building block, like a puzzle, where you join the pieces and construct the whole reality. Except what happens? You put a few pieces together, suddenly you put the capstone, and you realize it doesn't fit. And everything has to be rearranged now to fit the capstone, and you realize that whole thing is another piece for which something is needed, and so on. Unendingly, you keep on assembling pieces, and every now and then there's a revolution because one piece cast the whole thing. Give you a clue as to the nature of the ultimate knowledge being not an accumulation, aggregation of pieces. But this is our other limitation. First, we saw everything as pieces. Then we realized that the pieces themselves are partial. We do not know this piece completely. How would you fit it then? And third, the standard of knowledge is personal. Everything I view from my angle, my interest, my reality. Something as simple as the nature of life. We look out into the universe and say, unless changes similar to ours, unless the material is carbon-based, unless it is oxygen-based, unless it is exactly what we are, it cannot be otherwise. Why? No good reason. It's just an assumption. Assumption that what I am is all that can be. So there's even this thing, this is extended to a ridiculous extent by a principle which is called the anthropic principle, which is somewhat more complex, but to put it simply says about the universe by the very fact that I'm here and I'm conscious. And by observing myself and my relation with the universe, I should be able to figure out everything. It doesn't really work if you think about it deeply enough. The universe may be much more than you and much more than you're capable of knowing, and somehow that's ignored. And so, first we dwell in the ignorance, and then from there we judge everything by a broken, partial, and personal standard of knowledge. And this personal standard of knowledge is also to be appreciated more deeply when we see everything in the universe from the perspective of utility to me, as if I am the center of the universe. Now imagine two people, each one experiencing himself center of the universe, coming and engaging. As long as their interaction is limited to superficialities, you can have a practical harmony. But the closer they come, the more the differences of perspective, each being center of the universe, become more and more exaggerated until there is a clash and collision and complete breakdown. Because you cannot have two separate centers of the universe somehow coming close enough. It's as if the whole universe resists. If, on the other hand, both recognize themselves a part of the whole, you could overlap with each other completely in harmony without ever losing your individuality, and pass right through or interact fully without losing individuality. That would be the nature of the experience of a consciousness liberated from ego, meeting another consciousness liberated from ego. So this personal standard of knowledge is also perverting the whole reality, which is one continuum, into a center and a periphery. This particular twist is prevalent all the way through the highest levels of mind, including what Sri Aurobindo refers to the overmental consciousness. In the overmental consciousness, the whole of the infinite consciousness is known, the whole universe is known in its infinity, but from a personal perspective, from a certain angle, from a certain aspect. Even if the aspect is a universal aspect, still it is an aspect. And therefore is a limit. And eventually collides with another aspect. The aspect of beauty may collide with the aspect of knowledge, which may collide with the aspect of power, which may collide with the aspect of love. And that's how you have the possibility of the gods, each representing one of these aspects, entering in conflict in their action. And so in the Vedic yoga, not only the gods are invoked, a particular aspect of harmonizing the gods is also invoked, so that they may work together in harmony. And still that is an aspect. We experience everything according to the capacity of a limited consciousness and force, and are therefore unable to give a divine response or set the true value upon any part of the cosmic experience. So now comes the way we are experiencing our reality. Remember, first was the nature of our consciousness, dwelling in ignorance. Second was our nature of our knowledge of things, of experiencing. How do you experience things? The capacity of a limited consciousness and force. If something comes to you and your capacity to register is small, what would happen? It was very interesting. We saw recently, a few years ago, no, a couple of decades ago, 3 decades ago, when they had satellites in space measuring certain, I don't remember now what it was, some gases or certain molecules in the atmosphere. The assumption was that it would be in a certain range. And what was happening was the actual measure of it was so high that it was saturating the detectors, and effectively nothing was detected. I don't remember now what gas it was. But this is the nature of our senses. Something approaches, if it is too great for our ability to hold, receive, register the impact, we're overwhelmed, numbed. I gave the example, I think, last time. If all possible smells are suddenly released at the same time, it just becomes blank. They do that experiment. We just experience a blank, neutral sense. In fact, in the physics, we describe it in this way, that at any given point in empty space, there are every possible frequency at the same time, which is what creates the experience of empty space. The moment you shift the bias, it would not be empty space. Something would stand out against another. The all together becomes as if the baseline. When your capacity is limited and something greater comes, you're unable to register it. But if something smaller comes, you're able to register it only within the capacity which you have. So we're looking at the world and the range of colors. Depending on the capacity of our retina's sensitivity, we can make out fine distinctions. When with age, our retina sensitivity drops, we are unable to distinguish between certain fine variations of color or certain large variations of brightness. So it's a common problem with older people that you're in the traffic and if there are bright lights facing you, your vision is completely overwhelmed with the bright light. A younger eye, where the range of your retina's sensitivity is much larger, it sees this brightness and it still sees the smaller, dimmer things. And we literally recognize our power of sight is as if weakening. And our ability, therefore, to enjoy and experience things is less. I'll give another example. In the subtle body, the range of our sight, of vision, or of sounds or senses, any of the senses, is so much more that in comparison, our waking experience through the physical body senses is like a dim, dulled, reduced version of what is otherwise so much more rich. And it's the reason why when you wake up from a dream, your memory of the colors of the dream is faded and dulled in the wake memory. And that's why many people think that they dream in black and white. And at a time when I was experimenting to become conscious in the dream state, I had a dream in which I was semi-aware, semi-conscious. There was an interaction and experience going on with a very specific rich color, part of many other things, but there was a very distinct shade of a particular color. And I woke up with the thread of awareness in continuity, and I could literally see the full range of colors dimming, dulling, becoming flat. Like a record playing rich sounds, and then suddenly all the dynamic range narrows down and becomes like a flat, barely heard, soft thing. And that's what gave, for the first time, the sense of how much we are missing of life. But if you're stuck in this narrow band for all your life, you think this is all there is. I've given the example earlier of how so many animals have a richer range of senses. The butterflies can see into ultraviolet. Snakes can see into the infrared. When they look at our body, they can see the heat signature of different parts of the organs. And on the hand, they will see the heat line of the vein is flowing as the warmer line. So when they have to strike, they know exactly where to hit because it somehow stands out. The butterfly, as it approaches the flower, has many patterns which are only seen in the ultraviolet, which indicate where it should go to get the pollen. And it won't get stuck on the petals, but go straight to the center. A whole range, a huge, wide range of colors, which we do not share as human beings. And so with sounds, there are people who can hear a range which is higher than the normal. Normal range, they say, is 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Children, many of us, we could hear much higher. And we would often hear sounds which the adults couldn't hear. And we could train ourselves even to communicate with that. So we found a way to make the sound with our mouth. The teachers couldn't hear it. And across the room, we could communicate with each other, making this very high pitch, well above 20 kilohertz. The dolphin That's something even more unusual. It is able to see with the sound waves that it sends out and the reflections that come back in the water. And the imaging is in 3 dimensions. The sound waves come, penetrate you. Let's say you are the diver in the water next to the dolphin. It makes a few sounds which pass through your body. On each layer of tissue that it touches, there's a particular reflection, like a reflection of light, which captures the form and the internal texture. And in the dolphin's mind, it is received in 3-dimensional form. Seeing in 3-dimensional form, except that there's also the content of the texture, almost like a taste or smell. You can feel the physical surface 3-dimensionally, the physical substance and its texture, and how it responds elastically to the movement of sound. It's like rubbing a finger over the surface of those things which you're touching. So it's with hearing, it's seeing and touching inside you. Can detect when there is a tumor. It feels this odd, weird shape and can direct the sound. And this is occasionally we have heard from divers that they give you this sound bath. And one of the descriptions I've heard, suddenly this dolphin turned to the diver and made a sound starting from a high pitch and sweeping down continuously to the lowest pitch that it could make. And the diver felt his whole body resonating from the highest pitch, shifting, and all the vibrations all the way to the lowest pitch. And as if being scanned through with the sound bath. It was almost like a gift of an experience that the dolphin gave. All of this is possible, of which we have no experience. We can only imagine or translate in terms of our limited capacity. So the limited consciousness is unable to receive the impact of what? Remember, the tiniest piece in the universe is the whole universe, the oneness leaning forward to put up a front. If registering consciousness was infinite, you would experience it as the whole universe putting up this front. This flower would be experienced not as a piece cut out from a plant and thrown into my hand, but as the whole universe leaning forward, infinitely rich experience of the whole. Because my consciousness is whole, it can experience the whole in the... And you can imagine how that would be. Somebody is narrating a story. You pick up clues from their voice, from their intonation. You're aware that some people are somewhat dull. They may be tone deaf. Similarly, some people are emotionally dulled, unable to sense or feel what a person is seeing, inability to empathize. And it just means your experience of the narration is dulled somehow, narrowed and limited. Or in thought, a rich, complex thought, how much of it are we able to grasp to the extent that our own mind is narrow or rigid? We are dulling it. If our mind is wide and plastic, we can catch the full richness of it in all its nuances. One of the things that reading Sri Aurobindo in this way does to become plastic. Because he takes you to a particular perspective, then shifts you to the opposite perspective. This was it. He shows you the other side and you're convinced this is it. And then he shows you the way to synthesize both. And suddenly your mind has been broadened and made more flexible. Mental training you can have. Your consciousness is being expanded, literally stretched out. This process could be enormously speeded up by a conscious opening to the consciousness, which is already wide and free. So we experience everything according to the capacity of our limited consciousness. This is the other side. You're not registering enough, but also your ability to feel the impact of what hits you is also limited. You caress somebody, let the pressure be stronger. Caress of a gorilla, part my flesh. Isn't it? I know of a very sad case. We were in Africa, in a very large, one of the largest regions where the elephants move, owned by a private person. The daughter of this woman used to care for the elephants. And once it happened, she was doing something to the big elephant, and the elephant was annoyed and gave her a whack with its trunk. Now, they do that to their own children. When the baby elephant doesn't behave, the mother elephant will give a whack, and the baby gets startled and then follows. So here was the human washing the elephant, doing something, and something was not properly done, and the elephant, in irritation, gave her a whack. Pierced the tree and died. The body is so fragile compared to the elephant's body, and the elephant's light whack was enough to knock it out. The universe, behind the flower, gently putting out this perfume, and you can say, it's nice. But when it is a much larger impact, it may be overwhelming. Why? Our capacity of force is limited. Just as consciousness was limited, the capacity of force is limited. Not only in the physical tissue and senses, but also in our emotional range. There are regions or states of consciousness which are so overwhelming that we are unable to contain, as if we will break down. Often it happens in dream state. We enter some space and get overwhelmed. Either beautiful or sad, extremes, which are so complete that so intense, it just wakes up with shock. Or even in the domain of knowledge, there can be a certain power of knowledge, of an impact, which we are unable to hold, receive, or contain. So, we experience everything according to the capacity of a limited consciousness and force, and are therefore unable to give a divine response or set the true value upon any part of cosmic experience. So because in the first place we did not receive right, we are not able to give the right response. Or even if we don't have a right response, at least to assess rightly the value of this part of the cosmic experience. So the divine response one could give if we saw the whole and was able to hold, if we were able to hold the impact in its intensity. So there's also the impact. When the tsunami comes to hit me, of course my body would be blasted apart. But if it is a splash of water in the lake where I'm standing, I can throw back another splash and say, we had great fun. The splash is too intense, I am shattered or overwhelmed or drowned, and I'm unable to respond appropriately. Or to set in context, the tsunami came, so many thousands died. What does it mean? And I cannot understand how God can be so cruel as to kill so many little children. Most. Older people, okay, they've lived their life. Little children, they're so innocent. What have they done wrong? And it always bothers us deeply, because we're unable to see the larger movement behind, and so give true value part of cosmic experience, set the true value. This true value is something which we can appreciate only when we are able to see whatever action as the whole of the cosmos leaning forward to put this form, all other forms. There's a part of physical evolution about it would be rational, but to the emotions would be unacceptable. You'll see in nature a burst of 1,000,000 flowers, 1,000,000 fruits on a single tree. Of that, only 10 or 15, if you're lucky, will take root to become another tree. Let's say of all the mangoes which have come from this tree, all being eaten, at best one might get planted somewhere, if you're lucky, that also. Which one? Who chose that? And why do all the other seeds have to die? If you take it personally, it wouldn't make sense. Here's a huge civilization with a few million people, and suddenly there's a volcano which bursts out, and everybody's killed overnight. You know which was that in Italy? The Pompeii. Sometimes mother with child, Sometimes people having woken up, wanting to run instantly. Hot. And just gone. A few survived, perhaps. A few survived not because they managed to escape that, but a few days before they had left the place. What was distinguishing there? Perhaps we cannot see, we do not know, because we have the limited knowledge and limited capacity of understanding. But in the larger cosmic scheme of things, it may be like with the mangoes. Here, an experiment nature is working upon. She says, okay, this part is done. Now it's time to change. What is needed from the experiment is drawn out, and then the rest is poof, washed out. Mother speaks of the Chinese invasion of Tibet in this perspective. That something in that civilization had got so locked that it was unable to break free. And then comes this destructive power. But that which was the best of it, which was relevant for the larger evolution, was as if thrown out by force, scattered all over the earth. And today Tibetan Buddhism is such a strong force in humanity. And the other stuff, which had to do with a whole lot of black magic and a lot of darkness, most of it got destroyed. Very little survives only as an indication of what was. But that's it, it's gone. If you look at the big picture, do not take personally the sufferings of individuals. You can see, there is a certain rhythm in the way nature works things. But still we would want, ideally, that should not happen. It should not go through suffering or pain or destruction of this kind. And again, we can give an analogy here. When within your own body there is a form that develops out of harmony with the whole, you call it a cancer or an illness, a tumor, whatever form, well, internally you have to cut it out and remove. And sometimes that's the kind of surgery that also takes in the larger evolutionary process. We see cycles every 60 million years or so of some great destruction of life forms on the earth, followed by a sudden efflorescence of new life forms. And evolutionarily, it only indicates that which could not make the transition of that passage, climatic change or otherwise, rapidly dropping, and then that which can make the change breaking out in new forms. So the true value of any part of cosmic consciousness is not possible as long as you're looking at things from this limited consciousness or force. We experience limitation, weakness, incapacity, grief, pain, struggle, and its contradictory emotions, or the opposite of these things as opposites in an eternal duality, and not in the eternity of an absolute good and happiness. So there are 4 different things we need to look at in this to fully appreciate. First, the list of things we experience: limitation, weakness, incapacity, grief, pain, struggle, and then its contradictory emotions. So the sequence he gives starts from that which is the most essential to the more complex and distinct. Limitation. Everything within us limited. Consciousness limited, capacity of force, perception, everything is limited. As a result of limitation, weakness, because a situation comes up in life where your limitation is unable to manage. So you experience, I am weak, I am helpless, I cannot deal with the situation. With the weakness comes incapacity. I realize this weakness is fundamental to my human body, to my emotional being, to my mental framework, capable of understanding this, experiencing this, or overcoming this. Incapacity. As a result of incapacity, I suffer. That means all my life I will remain unable to overcome this, whatever it is that is bothering me. Grief. And then with it, pain. Now the pain here on 2 levels. When that incapacity experiences a pressure physically from something too great, it is pain. When it experiences that pressure emotionally and is unable to manage or contain it is an emotional pain. And what happens when you experience pain? The instinct inside the pain experience is to oppose, to remove, to block off. And so struggle, push back, trying to overcome, but knowing you cannot, unable to actually, all of life becomes a struggle because of our limitation, weakness, incapacity, grief, pain. It's only a question of degrees of the struggle. We're constantly struggling to overcome, to set right, to rearrange, to make the universe in our image. And with each of these, there is the contrary emotion. And these, opposite of each of these is seen as an opposite which is simultaneously present. If I have pain, I have pleasure. If I have sadness, I have happiness. And between these opposites, I find a swinging taking place. And it seems to be as if there is an eternal duality. One cannot exist without the other. If I am in a state of happiness, let's say unusual, after many weeks, something has happened that has made me happy. And now that happy continues, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day. Within a week or so, that's my new normal. I do not experience happiness anymore unless it is in relation to something else which contrasts it. So I must experience some sadness against which, oh, again I've become happy. The constant caress after a while becomes just a numbing sensation. I don't feel it anymore, what was pleasurable. Until either it stops or I experience pain, I do not contrast it with pleasure again, and so on. So always there is a sense of opposites in an eternal duality. And not what is the reality which would be experienced in the cosmic consciousness? In the eternity of an absolute good and happiness. There is an absolute good and happiness which is the nature of the cosmic consciousness, always complete, always an expression of the many colors of play of the Ananda. And in these are only waves, ripples and variations in the eternity of that absolute good and happiness. So this is the nature of our experience in the world. And finally, how do we assess, how do we absorb, assimilate, digest? What is their long-term impact on our consciousness and growth? We live by fragments of experience and judge by our fragmentary values, each thing and the whole. So here's one experience, over. Next experience, over, and so on. You see how it works in education, in school. Geography class, history class, mathematics class, language class, science class, chemistry class, physics class, mathematics class. But if you think about it, all these things are interconnected. You do not have geography without physics or chemistry or mathematics or human interest. Isn't it? History, in fact, is a creation of the geography. If you think about it, all historical circumstances finally boil down to certain circumstances of the land and the soil and the water. You have to go a little deeper behind. All great cities are on the borderline of some flowing water. If you didn't have flowing water, you could not have a great civilization developed there. Why? You need flowing water for communication, for water nourishment, for etc., etc. Of course, there's a occult side also, the flowing energy, which is regenerating, rejuvenating, etc. If a land is barren, all of the life values, all the cultural values, all the thought will be warped by or formed by the needs of that space. Rich and diverse with nourishment and food and comforts and luxuries will form its own kind of culture and type of people. Eventually, everything somehow boils down to geography influencing the history. All of that you could reduce to mathematical relations or chemical relations or physics or whatever. None of these subjects in themselves stands isolated. And yet our attempt to experience and understand the universe is catch this piece, then that piece, then that piece, then that piece. Somehow within you, they're supposed to fall into place and form a continuum, which of course never happens. So we live by fragments of experience. Now this you apply to your daily. Today I had that, tomorrow I have that, and then all these pieces accumulate somehow, or they replace each other, or they clash internally. And we judge by our fragmentary values, each thing. So in my own consciousness, because today I'm off mood, this whole experience had no value. Another time I'm in a happy state, and so even that trivial thing becomes very important for me. I'm unable to see things in their right relation. But in a cosmic consciousness, each thing would be seen for what it is against something which is an absolute reference. And we judge each thing as well as the whole. This whole life made up of so many pieces was worthless and wasted. That whole life made up of other pieces, oh, this was great and wonderful. But what's the reference point? Somebody became famous, somebody became notorious, somebody was never heard of in the public sight, but may have made a fundamental shift. But to our value system, it may have no reference. When we try to arrive at absolute values, because we're always struggling to do that, we only promote some partial view of things to do duty for a totality in the divine workings. So when finally a few of us get together and we have to make a decision, we have to have some objective reference, some absolute indication against which our different viewpoints can be aligned and something useful emerge. What do we do then? We take our limited aspects, try to make it the whole, and try to force it on the totality. We make believe that our fractions are integers and thrust our one-sided viewpoints onto the catholicity of the whole, of the all vision of the divine. So this fractions and integers, Sri Aurobindo uses this analogy also in Savitri. There is two sides to this. You see, fractions are piecemeal, not complete numbers. But when you look at the nature of fractions, we find most fractions can be represented in relations of two integers. 1 divided by 3 is a fraction. The fraction itself, if you had to note as a number, you can never hold in finite numbers, 0.3333333333 unendingly. You can never represent it physically. The only way to represent it physically is to write 1 divided by 3. When you complete the operation, you can never represent it. Anytime you stop, it's not exactly 1/3. Interesting, isn't it? The nature of this reality is such that there are certain fundamental, let's say, principles. They enter in relation with each other and create a whole range of mixed or limited compound experiences. Some of these experiences actually are glimpses of something infinite held in a finite experience. And so the use of the word fraction and versus integer suggests something that although it is partial, the partiality is not essential. Behind it are hidden the integers, the wholes, whose interplay creates for us the appearance of partiality in capacity. So let me give an example here. When I take a sheet of paper and blow upon it, the paper moves. You hang a piece, it moves. There's a relative pressure of air pushing. What is that pressure? You might say a few grams per square centimeter. In reality, that is not true. In reality, as the paper is hanging, there is the pressure of all the air, the whole weight of the air going up several hundred kilometers. And that pressure is about approximately 1 kilogram every square centimeter. Now that's a lot. Take a 1 kilogram weight and put it on a tiny patch of your skin. And each square centimeter patch, you put 1 kilogram. How many kilograms would this be? Surface of about 10 by 10. Easily 100 kilograms. Yes, at least, yes. At least 100 kilograms is pressing against my palm right now. I don't feel it. Why? Because on the other side, equally, there's 100 kilogram. And the pressure of the kilogram is so fluid that as my hand moves, it flows with it. And so I notice nothing. It seems like, oh, there's nothing. When I blow, a few grams per square centimeter is pushing. In the midst of two gigantic pressures of 100 kilograms each, a small variation of a few grams is what I experience as my relative world experience. What I'm getting at is, right now, at a still deeper level, there is the infinity of the whole universe pressing on my hand in this direction, and on my hand in that direction, and within my hand from inside each cell, the whole universe. What is it that we pick is the relationship between the whole here and the whole there, and the relationship it chooses to set with itself. You see the idea? All experience of relativity is nothing but the absolute playing with itself. Absolute meeting absolute. Yes. Yes. The actual pressure of the infinite and beside the infinite is never experienced by us because our consciousness is finite. We register only their relative difference as they set among themselves, or because there's only one, it sets with itself. So it's almost like this. You push with one hand, you pull with the other hand. If both are equally at the same time, and you have a, let's say, something in between, I push and pull at the same time, effectively there's only this slight force. If I push harder but pull slower, the imbalance is much greater. Or I pull harder but push less, there's the stretching experience. All relativity is inside this. Absolute playing with absolute is what creates the appearance of relative. And so this is what he's catching when he says, we make believe that our fractions are integers. The completenesses of things are playing to create the sense of fractions, of limitations. And we make believe that this is the real thing, when the real thing is not it at all. And thrust our one-sided viewpoints into the Catholicity of the all vision of the divine. If you take this into its full culmination logically, every viewpoint is nothing but the whole meeting the whole with a slight emphasis. And so my viewpoint is the whole meeting the whole with a slight emphasis. Your viewpoint is the whole meeting the whole with a slight different emphasis, and so on. The only way we can know all of our different viewpoints is when we recognize the underlying one whole which holds all these variations. And that's this Catholicity of the all vision of the divine, when the divine knows himself in every possible way, in every possible variation equally. And in that, we pick one piece and exaggerate and say this is all, and the rest is wrong. So all of this is natural consequence of our consciousness being in our individual ego, dwelling in the ignorance, and from there judging everything from its broken, partial, personal standard of knowledge and limited capacity of experience, and therefore limited capacity of response and distorted response and value of things. You can see in the context of the discussion of the oneness, we can understand why and how. What happens when we shift poise? What happens when the ego now loses itself and enters the cosmic consciousness? By entering into the cosmic consciousness, we participate in that all vision and see everything in the values of the infinite and the one. I capital, O capital, infinite capital, O capital, one capital. The values of the infinite, where everything is seen in terms of the whole infinity, and all aspects are seen as aspects of the same oneness, which is indivisible. So an infinity, which is oneness, indivisible. That is the nature of the Satchidananda and the cosmic consciousness. And in this, all perspectives are included as aspects in the one vision, which is the all vision. So by entering into the cosmic consciousness, we participate in that all vision and see everything in the values of the infinite and the one. And from that perspective, when we look back at limitation, when we look at ignorance, when we look at weakness, incapacity, pleasure, pain, struggle, what do they mean from that consciousness? After all, they're happening. Remember, in my body, I'm still experiencing something sharp poking in me, causing pain. In my consciousness, which is in the cosmic consciousness, I see the poking device as being infinite, my finger being infinite. The experience of the pain, what does it now represent to this consciousness? So this is what he describes now. First, limitation itself. We started with that. You're a piece, you're limited. Limitation itself, ignorance itself, change their meaning for us. Ignorance changes into a particular action of divine knowledge. Strength and weakness and incapacity into a free putting forth and holding back of divine force. So we'll look at each of these first. Ignorance. Remember, that was the consciousness which saw things, was itself a piece and saw everything as pieces. A particular action of divine knowledge. When the divine knowledge chooses to make an exclusive focus on this aspect or viewpoint of itself, and in that aspect or viewpoint of itself. Taking the analogy, example of the human hand. Each of our fingers, I could move separately. Although I am one behind, I could give to each of them a particular value. And to each, I could give a full concentration in that value. The result is, I am able to play the piano with distinct notes hit by distinct fingers. When each finger thinks itself separate and plays whatever note it wants, you have a discord. When each finger recognizes that it is only expressing one will behind and aligns itself with that will, then you have the harmony. So ignorance is only this particular action of knowledge taking up a special focus and all kinds of special focus. When the divine, you will recall we discussed last time, in the Satchidananda, all infinite possibility of everything that can be is simultaneously held. And when in that infinite complete awareness of oneness, there is a special focus of the awareness on certain possibilities, highlighting this, highlighting that, highlighting the other. And as if entering in focus on each of these to give it an exclusive feel, it's as if these begin to separate out. And that's how the sense of multiplicity begins to emerge out of the oneness as it is highlighted. But still there is a poise where the oneness is known behind the appearance. I am aware I have many fingers, but they are all one hand, one consciousness. And then there is a second transition where the consciousness says, now I will lose myself in the finger awareness. I feel pain in the index finger. I enter into the experience of the pain, forgetting all else. I have a pleasurable sensation in another finger. I enter into that, forgetting all else. Except in the Satchidananda, it is simultaneous. Each thing now begins to experience itself distinct and separate from everything else. And there is the sense of separation spreading out. And we have the experience of what is described in physics as the Big Bang. In reality, in the very nature of the equations of physics, the Big Bang never happened at a particular date. Because as you approach the point of Big Bang, time slows down. So the origin of Big Bang is as if timeless in its origin and beyond space in its origin. And somehow its very emergence creates the experience of space and time within it, itself being eternal and spaceless, timeless and spaceless. And so you move into this, which becomes the sense of the Big Bang and the spreading out and the distinct appearances and the consciousness of fragmentation of each of these fingertips, each of which thinks itself a separate person. But that's because the consciousness has the power to lose itself in a special emphasis. So he says, ignorance changes into a particular action of divine knowledge. Now, we have used this example before, worth repeating here. When you play with a child, a game, you do not reveal your full knowledge and your full force. You withhold. You play chess with a child, you know you can beat him in 3 moves. But you deliberately make a move which is weak or ignorant and match his level of ignorance or strength. You wrestle with a child, you match your strength with his. If he is weak, you make yourself as weak. And at that point, it's a special action of your force, of your knowledge, for a particular purpose, for the play. So ignorance changes into a particular action of divine knowledge. Strength and weakness and incapacity into a free putting forth and holding back various measures of divine force. So we come back to the example of the child with whom you are wrestling. As he pushes his hand against yours, you withdraw your strength and let your hand be pushed back. And suddenly you catch him by surprise by pushing with the other hand. And he's surprised and he tenses there. And as he's obsessed with that other hand, suddenly you spring a surprise and push back with this. And that's how you have the play. And there's a free putting forth. And then when you decide, you freely withdraw and weaken. Otherwise, there's no play. Free putting forth and holding back makes for the variation of strength, weakness, and incapacity. When you hold back too much, it is incapacity. When you hold back less, it is weakness. When you freely put forth, it is strength. Now think of this, what this means. Increasingly, as our consciousness aligns with and is able to express the nature of the divine consciousness, one at first accepts whatever play is currently happening, but then one can begin to engage in the play and freely put forth any intensity of force or withhold as needed. And this is how, when the divine intervenes in a given situation, especially when there are significant interventions in history, suddenly out of the blue in a single person, there is this huge strength, light, knowledge, extraordinary capacity bursting out, shaking up, changing circumstances, and then it is withdrawn and it's gone. If you look at the person, you'll say, such a person came, did this, and died. No. There are always persons coming and going in the forms. It is a divine force which entered, flowed into this person, completed its mission, and withdrew. A good example is Joan of Arc. You saw in her the afflatus coming, blossoming out, intensifying, doing what it needed to do, and then fading out, and suddenly should be like a normal girl. That intensity could sustain through the life if so needed. Generally, it builds up though as the personality grows and then withdraws at the end. And so we have what we call vibhuti. Literally the term vibhuti, bhu is becoming, special becoming expression of the divine consciousness. That's all the word means. Avatar, Tara is the Terra, the earth establishing in matter. Avatar is towards matter, descending into matter. That, unlike a vibhuti in which there is this becoming and withdrawing, Avatara is the divine himself descending as a manifestation, not simply a becoming momentarily. So the words carry the sense of the experience. But all of this is possible without limit to the divine consciousness. Now we may say there are practical limitations of the vessels which can hold. The power can come and the vessel may get overwhelmed and may get burnt up even in the process. So it needs a vessel able to contain, or it may distort and misdirect the power. And that's why the requirement from the spiritual perspective of an egoless center. You'll see Sri Aurobindo in one of his letters to Barin, his brother, says that all I need is 100 men free of ego, and the rest can be done. And he discusses what else they need to do to build the foundation on through which the action will work. But the idea that the receptive vehicle, the more free it is of ego, the more purely the transmission can take place without distortion. Otherwise, it works through the ego and there are distortions which come with that. And so it has to work through some limitation. Strength and weakness and incapacity into a free putting forth and holding back, always freely put out or held. Various measures of divine force, which is the only force ultimately. Equally, he says, joy and grief, pleasure and pain, into a mastering and a suffering of divine delight. That's interesting. What is joy? When the divine delight is mastered. What is grief? When the divine delight is suffered but not mastered. It is under pressure of the delight, unable to hold, unable to receive, unable to contain. Now in the Life Divine, Sri Aurobindo gives this example of the physical senses. What makes the distinction between pleasure and pain? Soft caress is pleasure, hard pressure is pain. What defines that line? And he says, if you intensify your vitality, suddenly that which was painful becomes actually pleasurable. Interesting. You drop your vitality, that which was pleasurable now becomes painful. As we've all experienced in certain states, when you have a high fever and your body is extremely weak, the slightest noise becomes to you overwhelming, disturbing, distracting, or shakes your nerves. When you're full of vitality and energy, you can manage far more intense situations, and it's fun, part of the play, isn't it? So it is with the physical contact of the senses, or sight, or hearing, or any of the senses, or the emotions, or even the mind's capacity. When you are able to rise to the occasion of the wave of the ananda that comes, this is joy or pleasure, emotional or physical, that's the difference, sensory. Joy, when it is in the emotions, you're able to master it. When you are unable to master, the wave is too intense for your ability, then you experience grief or pain. So the duality of joy and grief, pleasure and pain, into a mastering and suffering of divine delight. Ultimately, in the cosmic consciousness, all is play and shades of divine delight. Struggle into a balancing of forces and values in the divine harmony. So from the cosmic perspective, remember, on the paper, there was pressure on one side and pressure on the other side, and there's also pressure inside from within the molecular structure. When the paper is still, all three are equally balanced. When there's a shift in the balance, one side is more or other, there is the movement of the paper. What is struggle is precisely this play of balancing of forces and values in the divine harmony. When there is a shift, there is a move, something is changing, and the balance of forces is modified, that meeting of two forces and their readjustment we experience in our fragmented consciousness as struggle. So there is right now, for example, a huge struggle going on in the world between this interest and that interest. Interests which are in the forward evolutionary march, interests which are regressive. Selfish interests versus selfless interests. Progressive versus regressive, and so on. She'll say huge struggle. What do they mean? One force pulling this way, another force pulling that way. But what is happening from a cosmic perspective, it's as if the human material is being shaped and stretched and reformed. One side pulling, another side, one side pushing in this direction, another side pulling in that direction. The human material is being as if shaped and made more plastic, more elastic, and more conscious. The kneading that is taking place in the play of forces is what we see as the struggle. The result of the struggle, everything grows inevitably, and as we see in our own lives. We do not suffer by the limitations of our mind, life, and body, for we no longer live in these, but in the infinity of the Spirit. And these we view in their right place, in their right value and place and purpose in the manifestation as degrees of the Supreme Being, conscious force, and delight of Satchidananda, veiling and manifesting himself in the cosmos. So from this cosmic consciousness, you see the Satchidananda veiling itself in different degrees. And each of these degrees of veiling, we see their purpose and recognize their right place. What is being veiled? The delight, the conscious force, and the being itself putting forward himself in different degrees. When the Satchidananda moves to become in the multiplicity, there is the first higher grade, let's say, closest to its oneness, where it knows all these as facets of itself. Further grades where it knows all these as special aspects supported at the back by unity. And a further grade where it knows each of these as separate pieces. Within the separate pieces, there are relations of energy between them. And further separations within which those relations of energy recede into the background and are almost not seen. Until eventually, in the extreme separation, it's as if everything is broken up into the most extreme fragmentation. Anywhere that consciousness could divide, it divides further, 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 unendingly. And it is that extreme which we call inconscience, no form, no existence, only darkness. But it's only a position taken by the divine consciousness to as if lose itself into some kind of a, what we would associate as sleep, self-loss, self-forgetfulness. Except you may forget yourself, but you still are. And so that which is still there, and somehow it creeps out. And a few things pop out. We say forces, subatomic forces of attraction, repulsion, or subatomic intelligence which arranges these forces in patterns which actually are geometric. And we observe those and we say, this is a law of physics. No, it's not a law. It's just a pattern of the forces awakening, playing, and they form and reform and more complex. As that process goes on, they reveal more and more of what was forgotten and hidden. And we have the whole evolutionary return taking place. Practically, from inside the pieces, you experience gradations. Degrees to which the Satchidananda conscious or hidden. Degrees to which the being and substance of its reality is revealed or hidden. Degrees to which its delight and play of delight is revealed or hidden. The most extreme hidden is in conscience. As we emerge, there is greater and greater revelation, first of your own existence, then of the consciousness and its force of action, and then of the knowledge, and then of the delight. And that's what we call evolution. So from that perspective, we do not suffer these things anymore. We do not suffer by the limitations of our mind, life, and body, for we no longer live in these, but in the infinity of the Spirit. And these we view as in their right value and place and purpose in the manifestation. The body is the vehicle through which I am able to experience an objectivized, form-based relationship with other forms of Satchidananda. The life energy is that domain in which form breaks down and the energetic connection, pull and push of the play is experienced among all the forms and energies of the Satchidananda. The mind is that in which I experience the awareness of these relationships in their most complete, although finite, relation. And beyond mind, a further grade in which I experience all these in their infinite relations, and so on. Different degrees of the same thing. And so my body is serving a great purpose and utility and place in this particular aspect of the play, but I am not living in them. And he says, and we no longer live in these. Oh, sorry. Okay. As degrees of the Supreme Being. See, we view these in their right value and place and purpose in the manifestation as degrees of the Supreme Being, conscious force, and delight of Satchidananda, veiling and manifesting himself in the cosmos. So all these are through certain veils of the play, for the purpose of the play. We cease to judge men and things by their outward appearances and are delivered from hostile and contradictory ideas and emotions. For it is the soul that we see, the divine that we seek and find in everything and creature. And the rest has only a secondary value to us in a scheme of relations which now exist, which exist now for us only as self-expressions of the divine and not as having any absolute value in themselves. Nothing has value in itself except as an expression of the divine. The stone, you could say, this diamond worth so much, because that's the value in which the human life may place it now. Take that diamond onto an island where people measure value in terms of shells, and they will throw it away. Oh, it's a pretty rock. Or a piece of glass would be equivalent to a diamond. Sensorially, they're equivalent in experience. Or the scientific mind looks inside the diamond. It's just the same molecules as coal rearranged to become transparent. No big deal, right? So the value is shifting. But when you look from this deeper perspective, its value is in the way it expresses the divine. And the same divine is expressed in so many things in different ways, and that is its value. The flower is able to express the divine in a particular way, which is so precious, so valuable. You do not find it anywhere in nature. That particular vibration, which the mother refers to as the psychic expressed in nature. And everything is seen as that. You look at the animals. Each animal species has a unique quality or character of consciousness which is expressed in its form, in its behavior, and in its relations. When the deer springs, there's something, and you feel the quality of consciousness. Maybe you don't have a word for it, but you'll see in all their relations, in all their play, in the very form that is expressed. The elephant lumbers along slowly, and you feel the quality of its consciousness. Massive, ponderous, heavy, lasting, slow but deep. And you feel that, and everything in its relation is of that character, and so on. Everything is valuable for what it expresses of the divine. And the same for objects. When you recall all the experiences that we had with the mother, two which Panditji had once shared with us, it was in the playground that a very wealthy woman came to the mother, very proud of her wealth. And then one by one, she took out jewelry and put it in mother's hand. And every time she took out, she looked at mother's face for approval, recognition, acceptance, gave it, and then again took out slowly. And it was like she was the center of attention, enjoying the display of her wealth. And Panditji notes, mother took the whole pile and set it aside, didn't look at it again. Another time, he had received by post and taken to the mother a little pot from somebody in a village in Karnataka who every day had remembered and put 1 anna. It was very much in those days. You could buy an entire book for 1 anna, an entire meal for the day for 1 anna. So it's a lot of money. He had put it remembering the mother. And when the pot was full, he sent it by post. And the mother received it and she held it and she felt all that he had put into it. And Panditji observed that she showed it to everybody who came and said, he remembered every day and put this. The value is in terms of the consciousness and what it represents of the divine in it. And not the artificial, fake, human-created, egocentric, possessive, distorted sense of values. This would be the case for everything. We cease to judge men and things by their outward appearances and are delivered from hostile and contradictory ideas and emotions. Where earlier we saw, this is good, that is bad, this is against that, these two are not compatible. None of it is there because we see them, remember, as a movement of the cosmic harmony working and playing. For it is the soul that we see, the divine that we seek and find in everything and creature. And the rest has only a secondary value to us in a scheme of relations which exist now for us only as self-expressions of the divine, any absolute value in themselves. So all of this was for us, literally the mother's life is an embodiment of this perspective. And many stories one could dwell upon, but whatever comes around my mind, I'm trying to get as disparate as possible, broad canvas. At the Cottage Industries, which is now Cottage Industries, they had set up some new office and facility. And the mother was invited to inaugurate. And as she walked in, everything was clean, neat, arranged, beautified. She went straight to a corner where there was a closed shed and opened the door where everything had been thrown in pell-mell. And that was it. Her point was, you can create an appearance of pretty harmony, but the stuff inside should be equally beautiful and harmonious. We look at a wall, it's been properly, neatly plastered, but the bricks inside, if they're pell-mell, it doesn't have the same feel. If every brick has been placed, even if it's covered up, you can feel it radiate the harmony. In the domain of Indian sculpture, this aspect was, of course, strongly valued. And there's a story of a master sculptor whose child has been declared by somebody else as the greater master. And he says, how is that possible? So he's just carved this very beautiful idol, and the child comes and says, no, there's a flaw. And master says, cannot be. The story, of course, is a bit more extreme. He says, I will kill myself if you show me a flaw. And the child breaks the stomach. Inside the stone is a hollow. Now that's an imperfect idol. Inside it was not complete, you see. So, but the idea is, even inside is as much to be in harmony as the surface appearance. In a consciousness that sees the inside equally. Remember the dolphin who sees straight into you. And so you look at a person, you may be perfectly dressed and behaving, but what's the condition of your thoughts and emotions and your inner energies? That's equally beautiful or ugly. And the surface has relatively less value if inside it is ugly, outside you're pretty. But if inside it's beautiful, even if outside it's not so obviously beautiful, you have something much more valuable. And mother used to respond to people in this way, people coming in front of her, a man who has never spoken a lie. She saw the person and went, ah. It was narrated to me by somebody who was in charge of or working in the press at that time. They had just printed a book of Sri Aurobindo, and mother always wanted the first copy would be given to her. He took the first copy, and they had done their best in proofreading and all that. She took the book, opened on a page, put a finger on a word, and there was a mistake. And she said, I want it to be perfect. Why? You feel in the book the vibration of the imperfection when your consciousness knows inside out. And it went straight to show that. And this is the case with everything. Panditji had narrated another incident when mother wanted some particular quotation. There was a lady who was a fast typist and very proud of her typing skill. And she went and rushed through, typed everything, and all the pages were there. Panditji took it to the mother, and mother held it. She felt, and she said, mere labor. The state of consciousness of the typing was not in alignment. Mere labor. In everything, it just was obvious, and it was the first value that she gave importance to. So everywhere it is the soul that we see, and the divine that we seek and find. And one last incident, which is showing you how opposite the values are. There was a man who came to the ashram in military uniform. He was somebody in the army. And in those days, people had this reverence, oh, so-and-so, big name, fancy dress. He went to the mother, care of him. She was extremely kind, unusually kind, had him stay with her, go to the playground with her and all that. While all the kids were excited about this man. And after he left, within a few days, there came a new item that he had been arrested for impersonating. He was not really from the army. He was pretending to be for whatever benefits he got. And then they took the news to the mother and said, Mother, didn't you know? And she said, the moment he came in front of me, his soul leaped out, weeping. Suffocating in a personality which was so full of falsehood. Leaped out, weeping. And all the love and affection that she gave was to pacify that. The real person. The personality was already too hardened, too pretentious, too lost. But it was there that was her focus. And so she saw people only in terms of those values, from inside out in every case. Sometimes even at great physical cost, where certain families she took on because one child had a special potential. Sometimes we know of cases where the child left the family, stayed on. But it was great financial cost. There was another person who was in the Lake Estate. He had a creative mind, but unable to actualize his ideas. He would build something and then break it down, rebuild it, and then realize, no, something was not okay, break it down, again rebuild. And a lot of cost to the ashram. And they asked mother about it. She said, well, he has the mind, but this part is not integrated. And she was waiting for him to develop that through whatever process it was going on. It represented for her a special case of a human type which had this problem. And if in him that correction could be made, it would have a huge impact in that problem in humanity. And so many cases like that, which she saw from that perspective. Difficult human cases who we would have rejected and said, oh, it's a waste, she saw from a different angle. So we cease to judge men and things by their outward appearances, only as self-expressions of the divine. So too, no event can disturb us. Since the distinction of happy and unhappy, beneficent and maleficent happenings lose its force, and all is seen in its divine value and its divine purpose. Thus we arrive at a perfect liberation and an infinite equality. So this and the next line of the paragraph we will take up next time, which will be Friday after next. I think it's 2nd of February. Next Friday, I will be out of station, as also the Sunday next. We will have the class day after tomorrow, but we continue on the Friday after that. For those who are interested, we'll have a video uploaded online also, as well as we will have it shown here to continue the mood of the study. Any comments or questions? You can close with an Om.